Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought all in all that I would talk about this little video, and probably another video that I personally found very particularly interesting. And some of you overall have asked me to break down the Mark Migsayo versus Brandon Figueroa fight. Unfortunately, I'm just not really able to do that at the time. I ended up missing the fight as of last night because I was watching that of the main UFC fight card. And on top of that, I believe that the fight ended up happening on that of the PBC app. But for whatever reason, the app, for whatever reason, ends up making it a little bit difficult to see the fight the next day. I don't have PBC in terms of the cable package. I end up overall paying for it on the app. So when it comes down to it, all in all, maybe if I'm able to see that fight rerun tomorrow, I may be able to watch it and I may be able to give a little bit of a breakdown. But if enough of you are interested in a personal breakdown of that fight from me, certainly let me know overall and I'll try my best to break down that fight if I'm able and when I'm able to watch it. But anyways, this video and this topic I thought would be very particularly interesting because this topic, once again, is going to be over one of the greater and one of the more best fighters overall of the era that I ended up growing up in terms of the sport of boxing, with Mr. Vasyl Lomachenko. And for those of you overall, excuse me, that of course know that, what Lomachenko's next career move could be, we all know that he could potentially fight the completely undisputed champion at 135 pounds right now, Devin the Dream Haney, and that's a very big fight for both of them. A certain amount of people believe that that fight could go either way. I'm a personal believer that Devin Haney more than likely will win the fight, not only overall because of his skill set and what he can do and the type of style that he brings to the table, but also a little bit because of his size and also the fact that he's more than likely a natural 140-pounder. I think that is all going to factor into it. But Vasyl Lomachenko has been asked a multitude of times about if he were to face anyone within the history of boxing, and that his dream fight overall, if he were to fight anyone within the history of boxing or have a fantasy dream matchup, what would that matchup be? And Lomachenko has answered this a multitude of times, and he's always said the same thing: Floyd Mayweather Jr., which of course, Floyd Mayweather Jr., a very, very tall task for anybody because he is debatably, in my opinion and many others, the greatest boxer or the greatest fighter of all time, at least in terms of boxing. And that fight could have maybe potentially been interesting. Both of them, I think, are to a high level of skill in terms to a certain degree. But obviously, I believe that one fighter has to be on another level. But in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about Mr. Vasyl Lomachenko and possibly how he may have fared, at least in my opinion, against fighters like that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. or Manny Pacquiao, or maybe other fighters that probably would have been more comparable overall to his weight classes, at least in terms of when they were at their biggest. Maybe certain fighters like that of a Eric Morales or a Marco Antonio Barrera or some other fighters like that. And we're also going to talk about certain other fighters in the video, maybe a little bit about Mayweather and Pacquiao, just depending overall where the conversation goes. But anyways, Dante is going to talk about it. Let's tune in.
Dontae's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So Vasyl Lomachenko was asked recently if he could fight anyone of any era in the sport of boxing, who would it be and why? And Lomachenko, he said it would be Floyd Mayweather. He said, of course, I would like to fight somebody who is undefeated, who has a good history, who has a big name. I think the most interesting name for me to fight would be Floyd Mayweather. Now, this is not the first time that Lomachenko said this, but it's so interesting for so many reasons that he still says this to this day. But what I really question is, why would Lomachenko even be asked a question like that? He has 2 losses on his record that he never avenged. In his last loss, ESPN and him, they tried to make excuses for why he lost to Teo Fimo Lopez, claiming his shoulder was injured, although he continued to use the shoulder throughout the fight. Meaning...
And let me say this, I agree with Dante that was an excuse, at least in my opinion, because I did not hear anything about it before the fight. And on top of that, Lomachenko looked to be using the shoulder, at least in my opinion, in the fight somewhat fine. Now, there were certain fights in the past where he did have a little bit of a shoulder issue, like when he was coming off the the Jorge Linares win. Overall, he clearly did mess up his shoulder in that, and he was still somewhat relatively using his shoulder, even okay in that fight. So, is it possible? Maybe. But once again, I did not hear anything about the shoulder before the fight, so I don't really want to hear anything about it afterwards. It just is what it is. And Lomachenko appeared to be using it overall somewhat decently okay. So like I said, that's not something overall that I have really ever used within that of the past. But just to talk about Vasyl Lomachenko in terms of overall, in my opinion, where he stands in terms of all-time greats or where he ranks within that of boxing history. Well, I do think Lomachenko is a great fighter to a degree. But like I've said about certain other fighters in the past, he's within that same realm of certain fighters that I would call decently great. Certain fighters that they're maybe not all-time greats, but they're maybe right below that level. They just haven't really proved themselves enough yet, or all in all, maybe they're not quite on that level. Certainly, maybe certain fighters like that of a Guillermo Rigondeaux, or maybe that even, and some people may disagree with me, that of a Terence Bud Crawford. And some people may say, Terence Bud Crawford, how could you overall say that about Terence Bud Crawford? Because Terence Bud Crawford is, he completely undisputed. He was completely undisputed in one-weight division, and he's a three-weight division champion, and he's undefeated, and he's highly skilled. All that is understandable. But if Terence Bud Crawford ends up losing, let's just say, to that of both Errol Spence Jr. and let's just say that of Jermell Charlo, not saying that that's going to end up happening, but let's just say, because you never know when it comes down to it, what is really going to be his career legacy? And that's why I'm saying I really need to see Terence Bud Crawford in the ring with certain fighters that I think can actually compete with his skill set. And that's not me saying that what has necessarily happened in his career is all necessarily his fault. But once again, to really put the designation of an all-time great fighter on someone, I need to see consistent and repeated results. And that's why the only fighter really on the top 10 pound-for-pound list, at least the only fighters at the current moment in time, in my view, and certain people may disagree with me, that I would call all-time great fighters are fighters like that of a Canelo Alvarez and a Tyson Fury. And some people may say Tyson Fury, why would you mention Tyson Fury? Why would you say that he's an all-time great fighter? Well, because if you really take a look throughout the history of boxing, especially that at heavyweight boxing, there's really not a lot of repeated overall all-time great wins that a heavyweight boxer is really going to get. And the reason why that is because they're just really within one weight division. When you take a look at Muhammad Ali, there's only so much that he was ever really going to get. And the all-time great wins that he really has is Sonny Liston, George Foreman, Joe Frazier, maybe Floyd Patterson if you want to put that up there as well. And there might be another one that maybe I'm not mentioning, but those are pretty much the main ones that I can truly think of. There might be another one that I'm personally missing. Some may count Ken Norton. I don't really count Ken Norton as an all-time great fighter, but that's just my personal view when it comes down to it. And there might be one that I'm forgetting. When you talk about that of Lennox Lewis, how many all-time great wins does Lennox Lewis really have? He has, Evander Holyfield. I believe he has that of Mike Tyson. And I'm really overall struggling to really think of a couple of others. I guess Vitaly Klitschko when it comes down to it. And that's really about it. When you talk about, certain other heavyweight fighters, they only have a couple of decent all-time great wins as well. And Tyson Fury very clearly is the greatest heavyweight of his era. He got the Deontay Wilder win, which for his era was one of the biggest wins that a heavyweight could get. And of course, he was able to also completely embarrass that of Vladimir Klitschko in his matchup. All right? So once again, Tyson Fury, he does, in my opinion, at least deserve the credit overall of an all-time great fighter. That's just my opinion, but many people would disagree. That's just my view of it. But anyways, when it comes down to the overall, once again, how would have Lomachenko fared over that, in my opinion, over that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr.? I think that, in my opinion, more than likely that Floyd Mayweather Jr., that he probably would have dominated that of a Vasyl Lomachenko. And I like Vasyl Lomachenko. I think that he's a great fighter. But I do think overall that he is going to have certain limitations, especially against a fighter that is going to be that much bigger than him. And some people may say, what are you talking about that much bigger than him? Because Mayweather pretty much started at about 130 to 135 pounds. So what are you talking about? Are you being biased? And no, not necessarily. You have to take a look overall at a little bit more than just what both fighters started at. Because Mayweather, when it came down to it, he rehydrated at about 150 pounds. I think that Lomachenko rehydrates a little bit lower than that when it comes down to it, possibly even 10 pounds lower than that. And you also must think of this. Mayweather was a guy overall that had a decent amount of power and a 72-inch arm reach. Lomachenko, when it comes down to it, is a guy for, having extraordinary skill in certain categories. He's still a guy that has a 65-inch reach. And he's a guy, all in all, that can be affected and hurt with certain punches. And that's why, in my opinion, Lomachenko, he would have not fared very well against that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. I think Lomachenko has a great amount of respect for someone like a Floyd Mayweather Jr., as I think he thinks overall that he has great boxing ability, which he always had. Of course, talking about Floyd Mayweather Jr., because Lomachenko, of course, believes that he has great boxing ability, which I also think that he does. But Lomachenko also is going to have to get some bigger wins under his belt, in my opinion, if he's going to be remembered as an all-time great fighter. But the real fights, in my opinion, that maybe would have been particularly interesting for that of a Vasyl Lomachenko, maybe would have been fighters like that against a Eric Morales, a Marco Antonio Barrera, maybe even a younger Manny Pacquiao when he was around that 130 or a little bit lower weight classes. Those would have been particularly interesting fights. Those would have been very, very particularly interesting fights. Because Marco Antonio Barrera and Eric Morales, those could have been very competitive fights, in my opinion. They probably would have been around the same size. Eric Morales would have been a very interesting fight, a guy who could brawl it out with you, also a little bit technical. Marco Antonio Barrera, who of course has big wins in his own right over both Eric Morales, but also over Prince Nassim Hamed and a couple of other fighters, would have been very particularly interesting. Another fight that also would have been interesting, which was supposed to happen but never happened because Mikey Garcia made sure it didn't happen overall, was that of the Mikey Garcia versus Vasyl Lomachenko fight. That really was the fight that was supposed to happen for both fighters. But because Vasyl Lomachenko, overall because Mikey Garcia, because he was afraid to death of Vasyl Lomachenko, he decided overall to go on a suicide mission on that of 147 pounds to try and pretend that he was moving up there to be great, when really all that was a deflecting tactic overall to run away from Vasyl Lomachenko. But anyway.
Unlike Javonte Tang Davis when he was injured against Pitbull Cruz, Lomachenko continued to use all of his weapons, firing shots with...
Well, you know what? Let me state this about Javonte Tang Davis. And once again, Dante always loves to say this shit about certain people making excuses for their favorite fighters. But boy, when it comes to his fighters of a Deontay Wilder or certain guys that he doesn't like to lose, the excuses certainly come out just as big overall as the guys that he loves to talk shit about. But it is what it is. Anyways, what I'll say is this. Overall, when it came down to it, like I said, Lomachenko, in my opinion, a very decently great fighter, but he is going to have to get some bigger wins under his belt.
Both hands.
But also what I was about to say with the Javonte Tang Davis thing, I'm going to have to rewatch that fight. But a lot of people like to say that Javonte Tang Davis's hand, that it was really busted in that fight. I'm almost starting to question it. Because the last time that I really seen it, it looked like Javonte Tang Davis was throwing the left hand a little bit more over than what people like to let on. But I'm going to have to watch that. Maybe it was the right hand that people were alleging was injured. I would have to rewatch it. But the last time I watched it, it looked like Javonte Tang Davis. It did look like he was winging it overall to a certain degree.
And he would later admit right after the fight, the reason why he didn't let it...
In my opinion, a better example would have been that of Gary Russell Jr. versus Marco Vasyl, because it was very clear that something was wrong with that of Gary Russell's shoulder.
Hands go in the first 6 rounds against Teo Fimo Lopez because he felt he was not in range to land something on Teo and not get hit in return, which is the exact way the fight played out. That's exactly how it looked. Teo was controlling distance with the jab, and every time Lomachenko thought about attacking, he could see that Teo Fimo was setting up a counterattack. So instead of risking getting hit, Loma chose not to punch at all. You know, usually when you ask a fighter if you could fight anyone from any era, they're usually asking you that question because you're the best of this era. They always ask Floyd Mayweather that question because he's arguably the greatest fighter of all time. Not just the best fighter of this era, and he's never lost before. Lomachenko is a really great fighter.
Well, Lomachenko is one of the best of this era, but there's a difference between being one of the best of your era and being one of the greatest and one of the best in any era. And in my opinion, Lomachenko probably could have held his own in that of any era, especially against fighters in similar size. Like I said, the interesting fights would have been that of Eric Morales, Marco Antonio Barrera, maybe a Prince Nassim Hamed. In my opinion, he could have potentially won some of those fights debatably, but there's no confirming that when it comes down to it. So once again, it's going to be very interesting to see where Lomachenko's career goes from here. And in my opinion, more than likely, he's not going to beat that of Devin Haney. And some people ask me why. Why do you believe that Lomachenko is not going to beat that of Devin Haney? It's not necessarily, in my opinion, that Lomachenko doesn't have the skill set. But in my opinion, you have to be willing to really lay it all on the line. As what DontaesBoxingNation just said, Lomachenko really didn't feel comfortable enough overall when he didn't have certain angles over Teo Fimo Lopez, and he was afraid that he was going to get hit in return. And that's understandable to a certain degree. Once again, Lomachenko is a guy that is pretty undersized, especially with out of the arm reach, so he's always going to have to try to put himself in harm's way, but he's a defensively responsible fighter, so he's also going to try to move in and out of range, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to risk it to get the biscuit. And do I believe that he's going to do that enough against Devin Haney? No, I don't. That's just not Lomachenko's nature. Lomachenko overall has shown me that I'm not going to say that, he doesn't have grit. I'm not going to say all in all that, that he's not willing to exchange with certain opponents. But I just think that Devin Haney, I think he's going to be a little bit too big combined with his skill set. I just don't see Lomachenko really trying to get in there and really trying to go to war with Devin Haney, because I didn't see it against Teo Fimo Lopez when it came down to it. And there was a couple of other fights where he struggled a little bit as well. But we'll see what happens. And that is what Lomachenko is going to have to do against Devin Haney. He's going to have to try to go to war. He's going to have to try to go to war with Devin Haney. There is no debate about it, because if you don't, there is no way you're going to win that fight. I don't care how defensively responsible or how great you're moving in and out. At the end of the day, Devin Haney is probably going to be up on the scorecards mainly because he has that longer reach than Lomachenko, unless Lomachenko is able to completely avoid every single one of Devin Haney's attacks and avoid every single punch that is thrown at him. Do I believe that that is likely to happen? No, I don't. I think overall that more than likely Devin Haney is going to get his, and that there's going to be moments where Lomachenko gets his. But he needs to be very, very careful because once again, he almost resorts almost a little bit to that of the Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker overall mistake. And some people may say, are you really comparing Lomachenko to that, excuse me, Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker? Well, Lomachenko is a very defensively responsible fighter. I'm not going to say that he's quite on the same level as Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, but a big problem sometimes with Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, especially overall if you've seen that Oscar De La Hoya fight, even though I probably would have gave the fight to that of Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, is that oftentimes there were certain times where he wouldn't really throw enough. Now, he did in the big fights against Chavez. He did overall against certain other fighters overall like that of the ring. But in the Oscar De La Hoya fight, a lot of people personally thought that Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker got robbed, and I would have probably scored it for Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker. But one could also argue that he really didn't do enough in terms of the offense. He spent a lot of that time on the back foot, spending all this time dodging and maneuvering over those punches, which was great. Oscar De La Hoya overall really couldn't land a lot of flush punches, but you really got to get your offense in there. And that's what separates a fighter like that of a Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, in my opinion, overall, and that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr., because Floyd was a genius on both ends, and I think that Pernell was to a degree. You cannot be an all-time great fighter like Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker and not be great on both ends. But in my opinion, Floyd Mayweather Jr. was even a level above that of a Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker.
They were in the same weight class and both undefeated. It would have been a great fight to watch. But we all know if Lomachenko couldn't beat Teo Fimo Lopez, he has no chance against a Floyd Mayweather in this prime, pretty boy Floyd Mayweather at lightweight or junior lightweight. Another reason why it's interesting that Lomachenko, he picked Floyd Mayweather.
Well, listen, what I'll say is this. We cannot necessarily base what happened off of one fight that this would happen in another fight, because once again, that's fight math, and a lot of the times fight math really doesn't add up equally when it comes down to it. But at the end of the day, what I am going to say is this. The way that I seen Lomachenko, the way that I seen him be very uncomfortable in that fight against Teo Fimo Lopez and also in the Jermaine Ortiz fight, do I believe that he would have ever beat Floyd Mayweather Jr.? No. I think that potentially maybe he could have gave him some tough rounds when it came down to it. Maybe he could have pulled out 4 rounds, maybe, if he was lucky. But I just think that Mayweather, that he would have been too complete. And I think all in all that his power and his reach, that it just would have been too prevalent. Now, the real question is, once again, overall, is that if Lomachenko, overall, and Eric Morales and Marco Antonio Barrera, or who knows, even a Manny Pacquiao, when Manny Pacquiao was around that weight, could Lomachenko maybe have beat Manny Pacquiao? Because Manny Pacquiao at times, even though he's an all-time great fighter, sometimes overall he did get hit a little bit too much, especially in some of those earlier days. So who knows, maybe could Lomachenko have possibly beat Manny Pacquiao at that time? It's possible. But I still probably would have bet on Manny Pacquiao, because Manny Pacquiao, one thing I'll also give him credit for is this. Manny Pacquiao, when it comes down to it, he will exchange with you in certain times overall, or at least he'll try when it comes down to it, even at times if he's getting hit. There's a reason overall why he was able to pull out of some of those Juan Manuel Marquez fights. Very, very close and competitive fights.
When it comes to fantasy matches, is now he's about to fight Devin Haney. And not saying Devin Haney is as good as Floyd Mayweather, but he is definitely compared to a Floyd Mayweather, just like Shakur Stevenson is. So we'll see how Lomachenko...
Well, Devin Haney, what he is, in my opinion, is that he pretty much is a way, way, way lesser version of Floyd Mayweather Jr. He's about overall probably 30% or about 40% of what Floyd Mayweather Jr., in my opinion, was. I think that Devin Haney is a very decent fighter. I think that he's going to have a little bit more problems when he moves up the fighters that are going to actually be able to handle his style and his skill set when it comes down to it and are his own same size. But I could be wrong. We'll see what happens. Do I believe that Lomachenko is the man to beat Devin Haney? I think that with his type of style and with his type of skill set that he could be the man to beat Devin Haney. But do I believe that he will? More than likely, no. And the reason why that is, once again, is because Lomachenko, I just don't see him overall being comfortable enough to the point to where he's going to mix it up with Devin Haney the whole entire time, and he has to do that. If Lomachenko is going to beat that of Devin Haney, he has to get in there. He has to mix it up overall with Devin Haney. He cannot do this defensive stuff that he did against Teo Fimo Lopez, even if he fights a little bit like what he did against Jermaine Ortiz. I don't think that he's going to win the fight even if he fights like that. He's going to have to throw more combinations and more exchanges in the Devin Haney fight. He's going to have to go to absolute war with that of Devin Haney. He cannot be tentative in that fight, because if he is tentative, more than likely he's going to lose the majority of the rounds.
Does against Devin Haney. You know, I've told you guys this, even though Devin Haney is favored to win that fight, I truly believe out of all of the big fights this year, when it comes to Stephen Fulton, Inoue, Javonte, Tang Davis, Ryan Garcia, I truly believe Devin does have the toughest fight, because Lomachenko is so much better than Ryan Garcia and Inoue technically. So we'll see how it plays out.
Well, what I'll say is this, and I'm glad that Dante brought up that point, because that gives me a point overall to bring up. Once again, Dante a lot of the times makes his assertions off of what we would call fight math, or just taking a look at things on the surface level. You can't just take a look at a fight and say, well, you know what, this person might potentially have the toughest fight overall because this guy is all around the most skilled. You have to take a look also at what that fighter will do in those particular matchups. You have to take every single matchup like it's its own singular matchup. And when you talk about the Naoya Inoue versus Stephen Fulton fight, in my opinion, that's debatably a tougher fight for both gentlemen, because, once again, Devin Haney, in my opinion, he just has the type of style to beat Lomachenko. That's just my view of it. And when you talk about Ryan Garcia versus Javonte Tang Davis, I do also agree that Lomachenko is probably all around more skilled than that of an Inoue, and also that overall of a Ryan Garcia. But that's not always what leads to a tough fight. Styles make matchups when it comes down to it all in all, and there were certain times, if we were to talk about Floyd Mayweather Jr., for example, to where some of his toughest fights, they were not against fighters overall that would be looked at as one of the most skilled fighters in his career. Now, of course, it would still be somewhat be one of the more skilled fighters in his career, but not the most. The most skilled fighters in Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s career that he fought were that of Manny Pacquiao, with that overall of Miguel Cotto, Oscar De La Hoya, Canelo Alvarez, Juan Manuel Marquez, and those type of fighters, Shane Mosley. Those are pretty much the best. You know who actually usually gave him the toughest fights? Jose Luis Castillo, Marcos Maidana. Oscar De La Hoya gave him a run when it came down to it, even though he was a bit older, but he gave him a little bit of a run. Miguel Cotto, of course, gave him a tough time. But just because overall, when you take a look at someone technically what they can do, doesn't always mean that it's going to be a super competitive fight. When it comes down to it, take a look at the John Jones versus Cyril Gane fight yesterday. A lot of people, including myself, thought that that could have been a super technical fight. That fight only lasted less than 3 minutes. So once again, you never truly know what is going to happen. But in my opinion, we'll see. And I hope that Lomachenko puts up a good fight against that of Devin Haney. I just don't believe, personally, in my opinion, that he's really going to win the fight. That's just my personal opinion. I think that Devin Haney has the type of style that you need to beat Lomachenko, which is a guy that is going to be rangy, a guy that is not afraid to really overall get off a certain amount of punches and overall knows how to get the offense out there, is not, you know, afraid to exchange when it comes down to it. Now, what I will say is this. Is it possible that Lomachenko is going to be able to take advantage of certain defensive inefficiencies or deficiencies overall that Devin Haney has? Because Devin Haney, in my opinion, does not always have the greatest of defense. Now, it's improved a little bit, but he does get hit a lot overall in certain fights. I've seen it against Jojo Diaz. I've seen it a little bit overall in some other fights. It happened in the Jorge Linares fight as well, but I kind of give him a little bit of a break for that one because I overall think that he thought he was so far ahead in the Jorge Linares fight that he was kind of just letting Jorge Linares. I'm not going to say that he let him hit him. I don't think that, that's the right way to put it. But I think overall that he was trying very hard to knock out Jorge Linares. And with that came over Jorge Linares, hitting him with a good right hand, which stunned him pretty badly.
That's all I got for now, guys. On to the next one.
But anyways, that's all about it for today. I just thought that was a very particularly interesting conversation. But good luck to Mr. Vasyl Lomachenko and Mr. Devin Haney in their potential fight that may happen overall more than likely in May. It's going to be very interesting. I have Devin Haney more than likely winning by that of unanimous decision. I just think that Lomachenko, in my opinion, that Devin Haney has the type of style to make him very uncomfortable. We've seen it in the Jermaine Ortiz fight. We've seen it in the Teo Fimo Lopez fight. We'll see what happens. Devin Haney may not have as much power as that of a Teo Fimo Lopez, but he does have a greater reach than that of Teo Fimo Lopez, and I think that he has enough power to hold his own over Vasyl Lomachenko. So we'll see. Once again, it's going to be very interesting, and if Lomachenko ends up winning that fight, I'll of course eat my crow. I don't have a problem admitting when I'm wrong, but I just don't see Lomachenko winning that fight, in my personal opinion. He has the type of style and the skill set to beat that of a Devin Haney, but I'm not quite sure overall if he has the comfortableness overall to really exchange with him and go to war with him the whole entire time. Which, of course, is a little bit understandable because Lomachenko doesn't feel comfortable at times, especially with those bigger guys. He's not a natural 135-pounder. He's a guy that has a 65-inch reach. It's a little bit understandable, but Lomachenko, if he's going to be proven as an all-time great fighter, he has to win this fight, or at least win some other big fights after this, so we'll see what happens. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.